And I put a slide up. The only item on this slide that I probably won't say much about is the critical race theory, but I wanted to have those definitions up so you can just make reference to them as you want to throughout our discussion. Just to give you some background about me, I spent most of my my adult life just working in the corporate environment. I was not involved much in social justice at all. And I kind of, even though I was very successful, I never felt like I was kind of in the right place, so to speak. And so then I quit my job, and I decided that I would, because I've been a singer for most of my life, I decided that I would just sing. I said, well, maybe that's what I want to do. So I traveled all over the world singing. I sing jazz and gospel. And I traveled all over the world singing, had a really great time, made a lot of money, but still felt like that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. And so I decided what was missing was that there were so many things that were going on in my community, the African American community, where I felt like I really needed to be more active in the community. A few years ago, before I decided that I would come back and finish school, a woman asked me a question about African American history that I couldn't answer. And I felt I was just overwhelmed by the whole fact that I couldn't answer this question. That my husband and I, my husband is here on camera here, my husband and I decided to do a series of documentaries. And so we did an outline of these of what we wanted to do. We traveled all over the country on our dime, doing documentaries on African American history, which actually ended up being a few of them were actually award-winning pieces. So we finished about, I don't know, about 35 of them, 33 of them or something. We had planned for 26, and they're online. So if you'd like to see them, I can let you know where they're at. But I ultimately have come, I guess, full circle, back in school, and I decided that I really wanted to get more involved in social justice. So my I'm just going to review some items here. I know it looks like it's a lot, but it really isn't. Before we get started with our discussion, I wanted to have this roundtable really highlight the uniqueness and the significance of culturally relevant pedagogy and its role in successfully narrowing the academic gap of African Americans. My dissertation actually focuses on reclaiming culture. How do African American teachers enact culturally relevant pedagogy in the classroom in an age of neoliberal reform? And you know, we'll get to talk a lot about this hopefully before our session ends. Really the intent of my research is to understand the perspectives of successful African American teachers and how they view students' basic cognitive process and development, including academic accomplishment, cultural competence, socio-political awareness, and how they successfully utilize culturally relevant pedagogical strategies while working through or working to navigate through a neoliberal educational agenda. When I think about or talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, the definition is kind of up there. It's somewhat more broad than that, but Irvine argues that the race and culture plays an important role in influencing African American teacher pedagogy, curriculum, and interaction. And I feel like I really don't want to get really too much into too much of this, but I wanted to kind of give you just an idea of why I think it's important African American or culturally relevant pedagogy is important for African American students. Latson Billings research examines instructional strategies utilized by successful African American teachers, and they found that the approach utilized offered a culturally relevant pedagogy that included subject matter that related to life experiences and culture of African American students. I would submit that the whole process of learning in the classroom is as much for the teacher as it is for the student. So it's really important that educators believe, or educators be cognizant and knowledgeable of cultural and socioeconomic background of the students in order to be successful. Research shows how personal lives of African American teachers inform their practice, or the personal lives of any teacher inform their practice. So often many of us feel that our challenges are only experienced by us, but we fail to realize how much it means to a student to hear that we face similar issues, and particularly African American students really need to realize that they're not going through this daily struggle by themselves. There are other people who have gone through the same thing and have really done well through that struggle. One of the things that I think is a real problem with culture, and not so much with culturally relevant or culturally sensitive pedagogy, but the fact that we don't have enough African American teachers. We have a teacher shortage. The shortage of African American teachers and the overall contribution of their expertise continues to be a missing link to what could be significant to improving the educational experiences of African American students. Research shows that full-time U.S. public school teachers consist of 82% white, 8% black, and 7% Hispanic across the U.S. So as you can see, that, I mean, there's clearly a shortage there. Over 38,000 African American teachers were fired following the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was in May of 1954. And those numbers have never bounced back. We've never recovered from that loss. So when you think about that, you think about coming out of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, when all of the black children were being educated by black educators. Then you move to Brown versus Board in 1954, where now we're integrating schools. Well, the whites didn't want black teachers to teach white children. So over 38,000 teachers lost their jobs. And those numbers were never recovered. So I look at the current climate where we're at today. Alexander in 2010 suggests that African Americans have been crucified by what she calls conscientious blindness. She goes on to say that people of goodwill have been unwilling to see black and brown men in their humanness. And this indifference to the plight of others is what supported the institution of slavery and Jim Crow. So when we look at neoliberalism, which by definition ignores the plight of marginalized populations, it brings a sense of urgency to improve the education for African Americans. For example, the result of a recent study, 47% of African American men in Chicago between the ages of 20 and 25 and this was a 2016 study, are unemployed and are not enrolled in school compared to 10% of whites. A Brookings article, public high school students in the year 2011 and 12, 85% of those who graduated were white, 68% were black. So not only do we have a teacher shortage, but if our kids can't get out of high school, they're not likely to become teachers. So we really have to have this push where we get our students out of high school and on to college, and really start to look at the profession of education as a possible way to go, because this really is our future. I want to talk just a little bit about neoliberal reform, and then I'd like to open this up for discussion. Teacher education seems to be an area impacted by neoliberal reform. For example, privatization, for-profit and non-university-based teaching preparation programs and staffing options. The use of standardized tests to measure teacher quality, and the deterioration of teacher unions as a voice in teacher and educational equality. Neoliberal reform has received heavy criticism from education scholars about its application to public education. These criticisms are grouped in 3 categories, and they're presented as critiques. So at the core of each of these critiques is the assumption that education is fundamentally a political process, and that neoliberal reform is in conflict with the role education should be playing in a democratic society. So these critiques are a reproduction of power critique, which sustains and promotes capitalism, a democratic critique, which sees the disparities resulting from neoliberalism, and a social justice critique, which suggests that the primary role of education is to empower marginalized populations and redress social inequities through democratic education. So when considering neoliberal reform, scholars have argued that class and race inequalities will reproduce themselves because the privileged are in a better position to compete over the limited resources of the best teachers, the best schools, and are thereby in a better position to compete for the best students. I think as I continue my research, I'll need to really unpack these critiques a bit more and the concept of empowerment. But I think that this probably gives us a pretty good foundation for discussion. So I want to just start off with a question, and if anyone wants a copy of this paper, I do have some here, so you're welcome to take one. How can culturally, well, first let me ask this. What do you think of culturally relevant or culturally sensitive pedagogy? What are your thoughts on it, just in general?
I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary for students to just understand the sense of self. You learn from your environment and the person teaching you can instill or reinforce the things that you are familiar to you. You will grasp the concepts. It's more relatable. All of those things. That's it.
Okay. Hold on one second. Did you?
I was just like, everybody who know me now, they know I like asking questions and using examples. So here is one for you that might relate to pedagogy. I'm teaching a class at Columbia College, called Professional Practice. So it's for grad students that's getting ready to enter the market of engineering and architecture. And I'm thinking I'm doing a good thing because I'm from Inglewood and I'm teaching the way that my culture has taught me. And I make a statement to the class. And I said, so whenever you get out there, you know, you make sure you get the money you deserve because you know this stuff. I'm telling you, I've taught you everything you need to know. You're gonna, you know, don't let them Jew you down. Now we know what that means. I'm coming from African Americans, but I found myself in the president's office, you know, being reprimanded. You know, so I don't know if that's, you know, it has its pros and cons, I guess.
Yeah. That's an interesting point.
That's real good.
Does anybody have any?
I think that it continues to, you know, remain relevant because if you continue to teach it, you know, it can span from generation to generation. I mean, I remember when I was in school, you know, it was taught to me. You know, I had a librarian. It was a library teacher that I had, and you know, she was white, but she taught me my culture. She always had pictures of African Americans outside of her library on the walls. You know, in 8th grade, we had to write a paper in order to graduate, and the person that I chose to write that paper on was a African American male by the name of Charles R. Drew. So I learned him and I learned his story, and I learned that it's because of him that we can get blood transfusions, and you know, he's saving lives now of all cultures. So I think that is very important that, you know, it's needed, and it's needed at the kindergarten level, not at high school, not at college. It needs to start when they enter school.
So I can say, what's your name again? Johnny. I can say, I can kind of see his perspective too. I still like to believe, or be open enough to believe that we live in two different worlds. The reason why I say this is because he just brought up a good point about something that he has said that is offensive to someone. But I have a nephew that was enrolled in another university, and they were having, it was a business ethics class or something, all different cultures in that class. The person teaching the class was white. So they started out by opening, and I don't know how they got on the conversation, but they were talking about black preachers. So the person teaching the class said, you know, there's this stigma with African American preachers. However he put it, but there were several blacks in the class, but there were other nationalities. And so he's projecting his opinion out to the class, so that could be considered his cultural pedagogy, right? And he's saying how there's this negative stigma, they always look like this, or they always present themselves this way. And then my nephew, who's in the class, he's just kind of laid back observing what's going on, because he's younger, because, you know, this is a night class of people, you know, pursuing their bachelor's. And he said one thing he noticed was there was this attack on this African American preacher, not one specific person, but he said, but couldn't we say the same for what happens with Catholics? Now, this is just his perception from watching what's going on in the world. And so he said to the instructor, well, we can kind of say the same thing about how the Pope lets people get away with whatever. He was kicked out of school for 6 months for that statement. And when I found out about it, I was like, you should have told me. There's no way a discussion can be open like that. And then when you say something that offends the teacher, now you said something to offend the school. And so he was put on academic probation. He's only like 26 years old. But his whole thing was, we were all speaking freely our opinion. He said, I even sat back to observe what was going on in the class. But if you talk about the culturally relevant pedagogy, that instructor was projecting his pedagogy, and then these people started interjecting, and everybody really was entitled to their own opinion. But his opinion was one that he didn't want to hear, so he had to step out of school for 6 months. And I thought that was so unfair.
Interesting.
How can that happen in an academic setting?
That's what I said.
I'm flabbergasted at that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What school was it?
I'm sorry.
It was University of Phoenix.
Really?
Oh. Well, there you have neoliberalism.
Right, Denise.
Yeah, Tecora, I'm so glad to hear your talk. and touching on issues you know are dear to my heart. And it seems to me when I'm hearing this conversation is how it's so important to think about how culturally relevant pedagogy is intrinsically related to concepts of democracy and equality. And so it's partly about everyone being equally represented and legitimate in a classroom and as individuals and in relation to content, but also that we all recognize that we're all culturally situated, that we're all cultural beings. Usually the people who don't realize that are white men, because they don't have to, right? But white people in general, you know, vis-a-vis dark-skinned people, men vis-a-vis women, et cetera, et cetera. And so then, if we're all mindful, so it's also a matter of folks whose cultural experiences are marginalized being brought into the center. In the process, all of us recognizing the role we play in being responsible about creating a classroom culture or a learning culture based in democracy and equality, right?
Right.
Otherwise, we're just kind of shifting power around and still playing the power games.
I think in a more homogeneous society, like in a more homogeneous society, like in Japan, for example, like this wouldn't necessarily be as big of a conversation, because then how many cultures actually have to coexist within Japan? And they're already, I mean, they're explicitly xenophobic because of very specific values that they hold, which works for them, but now it's posing a different set of challenges in terms of like they need more support staff because their population is aging. But like I think our challenges are very specific to the American beginning and growing experiences of what it means to have to come in already starting from a very unequal playing field, and then how do you then live up to or work against or challenge this legacy that we are all like challenged to. For me, coming in as an immigrant 20 years ago, and then the new waves of immigrants that are coming in, like these challenges are always going to be here because of the way that we started. And I feel like anybody who pretends to ignore that culturally relevant pedagogy isn't important is somebody that's ignoring a very critical aspect of what it means to be an American, what it means to exist within our very specific culture. Like for example, in France, like you're supposed to be very, very French. Like our ability to call ourselves Vietnamese American or Asian American is very specific to American experiences of race and race identities. Because if you're Muslim and you're living in France, you're expected to be French. You're not gonna. There's not much room for you to be Muslim French.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
You know, so I think that's a responsibility that we as educators and as learners, right? And as parents as well, like having to just have that around at home and then in our social groups, as well as like it's not just the responsibility of the teacher or of the government like to be doing this part, right?
I think it's also important that as an educator we have to be very cognizant of the fields of knowledge that's walking in the door with each student, because they're bringing in something that is very culturally a part of them, you know. And one of the other things is that we're in a global society now, so it's not just, I mean, for years, racism to me was just, it was whites against blacks. Now it's, you know, it's a globalized society, so everybody has an element, unless you're of the dominant culture, then you're most likely going to be discriminated against in some way, you know. But I want to get this next question in before and have some time to discuss it. So how can culturally relevant pedagogy be effective in a growing diverse educational environment that is heavily impacted by neoliberal reform? How do you think we can really bring this into the classroom?
Well, we were just talking about this in the last, it was right here, I can't remember what it was called. We were just talking about this in one of the other, it was an education roundtable. We were talking about how we need more like diversity within the teaching community, how, like you said, 80% of teachers are white, and then even more than that, you know what, especially in elementary school, 90% of teachers are women. So there's a lot to be said for like familiarity and feeling comfortable with the people that you're with, and feeling comfortable with somebody that looks like you and acts like you. So I feel like bringing more diversity to the population of teachers, whether it be elementary school or professors or whatnot, can really help to bring in that culturally relevant pedagogy, and even if not that, bring in comfortability with a teacher, because at least you feel like you have a connection with them.
Anyone else?
When you ask that question, are you asking for practices in the classroom itself?
I'm asking for practices, but also think about the preparation of teachers and how that plays out in the classroom, because you can't teach what you don't know, right? So you know, how can that culturally relevant, culturally sensitive pedagogical strategy come into the classroom?
Well, I'm at National Louis University, and we're historically a place that teaches teachers. So we're known as the College of Education, where we train teachers. But you know, I've been getting to know the College of Education side of our university, and my understanding is they don't really get training in this kind of way of thinking. Like there's like a whole set of assumptions embedded in education as a discipline that they leave out all psychology thinking, which is interesting to me as a psychologist, right? So I feel like they just make all these assumptions about a learner, about what it means to be a teacher, about what it means to be in a classroom, and how to get a lesson learned. And even our educational outcomes, like what we're thinking of as ideal outcomes from a class. You know, it doesn't take into consideration the individuals in the room, the diversity of people in the room, and their feelings and their experiences and their stories, and whether or not the material they're teaching is actually touching the way people experience life.
Yeah.
So it's a black box in education training, is what I see.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that everyone who walks through the door has an experience that may be different. So how, as an educator, can you tap into those many experiences that you have in the room? Because and still navigate through this neoliberal reform that is, you know, forcing you to teach to the test.
Well, and also that has a bearing on the efforts to diversify the teaching population and improve it into teaching, because it's also deprofessionalizing teaching. And so those students of color who do come through and do really well are increasingly discouraged from going into education, especially K
Yeah.
education.
Yeah. How can, yeah.
I taught at a community college in a suburb where it was predominantly white. And I taught whenever the topic came up about diversity and inclusion, it was a very sensitive topic because you had to introduce certain stereotypes to the class. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was more like not introducing them, telling them what these stereotypes were, but I had to also step back and realize that for them, it was me introducing it to them because they didn't realize that they had these certain biases and stereotypes about the African American or Latino population. And so, but no one taught me how to do that. I had to learn. The first class was very uncomfortable, and then subsequent classes I became better at it because I became more sensitive to a different perspective. And also, they didn't really see African American teachers teaching this content. So I had to take my personal feelings out of the equation, even though it's a sensitive subject for me, and experience it through their lens. And maybe they hadn't dealt with the.
Okay, because she is a white educator who wrote an article on privilege, unpacking the knapsack. Actually, the very first time I read that article was in Janice's class. But there are a couple things that I want to say about what you just said. Janice Hertig was one of my professors at the master's level here at DePaul. And I was in one of her classes. It was diversity.
Developing cultural understanding.
Yeah, developing cultural understanding. And you are absolutely right. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Tiffany.
Tiffany, you are absolutely right. It is really a tough subject. And Janice was teaching it with another white educator. I told her that I wanted to teach this class with her. But she was teaching it with another white educator. And there was a gentleman in the class, and I think if I was any lighter, I'm sure I would have been a beet red. This guy was in the class, and African American. He was African though, and he said that he was a security guard at one of the grocery stores on the north side, and he was watching all of the black people come in because they were the ones who would steal. And I was like, do you remember that? And I was just like, you know, so we all have to deal with this. Even blacks have to deal with stereotypical comments from other people of color. You had a comment?
I thought it was just kind of conflicting. It's kind of hard because the cultural relevance, I'm pro that, right? I feel like it should be a community psychologist in every school. There should be, every political person should have a community psychology background. You know, the mayor should have a community psychology background. I'm all pro community psychology, but when you start talking about neoliberalism, is where I find it kind of difficult, only because I was in a situation where we were, you know, I learned about the community before when I was called to come and teach in Robbins. And I made this thinking quick, and before I went out there to teach, I did my research. I was like, okay, Dwayne Wade went here. Is it a African American community? And it was like, yeah. Then when I got out there, I was like, it was heavily Hispanic population. You know, it was like about a mix. And then what I noticed with the neoliberalism was that when it came down to take the park exam, it was a lot of conflict. It was like, we're not taking it, you can't make us take that test is biased, and blah, 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 blah. And I just thought it was like a measuring tool to see where the progress of your kid had developed. And the superintendent and the principal was like, they don't have to take it, Johnny, they don't have to take it, you know. And I was like, well, how are you gonna measure? And she was like, well, we're gonna measure the teachers, because I'm gonna get the teachers out of here if you know, something, you know, I don't want to go into that subject, but I was just finding it kind of like a little, you know, that neoliberalism thing is tough.
Well, you know, I'm old enough to have actually been in school at a time where teaching to the test was not part of the
Yeah, there were no standardized.
There were no, and I still got out of school. You know, it still worked. You know,
I think so they was kind of saying, like, the superintendent that asked me to come, she was saying that the exam is not for the kids necessarily. It's for the teachers to see if they're doing a good job or not.
well, keep in mind that no child left behind was put into place because they wanted to measure what was happening. They wanted a number. They wanted to put the amount of what a child could learn and put a number on it, and it did not consider everything else that was happening with the child, the socioeconomics of it, you know, the poverty around it, none of that was considered. You know, so all of these educational policies that have been implemented since Brown versus Board, because even though that, you know, some people look at that and says, yeah, we need it to be integrated, but there were some real problems that came from that only affected the poor community, the black community. You know, we lost teachers. It tore the community apart. The doctors that lived on Drexel moved because now they can live in Lincoln Park, you know, and they thought that was good, you know. So all of our role models moved out of the community, you know, which meant that the black businesses that were in the community dried up because the people with the money left. You know, and so I mean, and No Child Left Behind, the problems with that process hit the black community. You know, schools started to close. They started to close in our community. So these policies that are being put into place are not being helpful to us. And somehow, as educators, we have to be able to talk about and come together in some way. I don't know what that way is. I wish I knew the answer, because if I did, I'd do it. You had a...
And I just wanted to also to add to the No Child Left Behind, as I was reading for my research, it was basically put in place to pretty much make states responsible for these schools.
Yeah.
So now that you have this issue, you know, it's almost like trying to find a scapegoat.
Well, you know, education is a state. It is a state's right. I mean, the schools, the states are responsible for the schools, but they, you know, I don't know.
I think in response to the issue of tests, it links back to the question of cultural relevance, because those standardized tests, there's a huge amount of research that's been done on the lack of cultural relevance of those tests going way back. So there's that issue.
Yeah.
They were designed originally just as kind of measuring posts to see school progress and not meant to be disaggregated by student to begin with, because back in the day, people didn't think you could measure learning, individual human beings learning with a test. And so it's also, I think, when we talk about culturally relevant pedagogy is meant to rehumanize, dehumanize people, standardized tests intrinsically dehumanize people. So,
Well, I mean, there's been a whole list of literature about, you know, standardized tests not being culturally relevant, but there's also been a whole list of literature that shows that, you know, like a stereotype threat, like when a minority or when a woman checks a box that says, I am African American, I am a woman, I am this, I am that, they score lower just because they recognize before they take the test that I am this minority, and they recognize that the stereotype is that this minority scores lower, and then they score lower. And it requires, in No Child Left Behind, I just read this last night, that you have to test these students and you have to have them account for their ethnicity and gender, and then you have to, you know, because they want to know what ethnicities score higher, but it's like, why? I don't understand how, now that we know that this is in existence, how we can still be testing people and making them check these boxes.
Yes.
Right? Like, why are we still doing that? I don't understand. Right. So that's a whole nother animal.
Well, let's get back to your point about maintaining the status quo. I mean, you alluded to that in some of your comments when you started, I think, and how the education system is really just designed to fail a certain group of people,
Yes.
right? To keep things in the same hierarchical way it's been, and promoting this dominant way.
Yeah, if you think of the educational system, it hasn't changed since it started after Reconstruction.
And like Hannah says, I think they usually do that because it is a business, because it goes on a census, and you know, censuses are important when you're trying to get funding and some more things. It still has to be in place. It's not good. It's not for any other reason, but we have to have a ratio of this to this in order to be that. So that's why censuses are created. So there goes another word that has nothing to, it's just too much.
Well, listen, I don't want to go over like the last group did, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Such a wonderful, fruitful conversation. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks a lot. And if you'd like a copy of the paper, it's here.
I'm gonna do homeless. I'm gonna do homeless, but you're gonna do impact.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we're both, oh, no, you're saying good.
Yeah.
And then you're feeling out.
Yeah.
You have to leave. You have to work at work.
Yes, I do.
Four to one.
Well, I have to leave, what's a coffee shop that serves alcohol? But I pay leave for reason I left all of my stuff. This girl. Oh, is that what time? I was like, I have to go with my suitcase.
Yeah.